Chapter 2. June 16th at 10:23 a.m. 2 months later, the police station, a huge stonework building, towered above Sam, blending into the gray skies above. Or maybe she just felt small. Insignificant. She couldn't imagine choosing to spend time in this depressing place. It only needed gargoyles hanging from the dormers to complete the picture of doom. The entire idea of what these people did defeated her. She understood the necessity, yet given her insider knowledge, this whole human viciousness thing was too much. She wouldn't be here now, except another woman had been murdered. Given her past interactions with the police, even that wouldn't have been enough to make her sign up for more. The last cop she dealt with had been one badass bastard. No. The ring had brought her here. This morning's killer had worn a similar ring to the one Sam had seen a couple months ago in another vision. She'd caught only a brief glimpse of it then, with the memory surviving transition to burn an indelible mark on her heart. Even the mask and gloves had looked similar. The biggest nail in this guy's coffin had been the energy. Like DNA, the energy for each individual was unique, a personalized signature, so to speak. Both killers had the same energy, the same variations in wavelengths and ripples. Even the same vibration. But that was hardly police evidence. Knowing that some asshole had killed again filled her heart with sorrow and slowed her steps. Several fat raindrops splattered her face, the joys of living along coastal Oregon. The weather didn't bother her, the crowds and noise did. And the smell. Exhaust, sweat, and perfumes mixed to become something only a city dweller could love. No, the outlying community of Parksville suited her perfectly. The trip into Portland was only 20 minutes on a good day. Strangers with umbrellas shouldered past her. Would any of them believe her if she told them about the murders she'd witnessed, experienced? She'd faced distrust and skepticism with every foster family. As a precocious 6-year-old, she'd told her foster mother's coworker to look after her son better. She'd been punished at the time. But when the boy had drowned in his backyard pool, Sam had really suffered. She'd been dumped back into the system, and the label odd had been added to her file. Her gift scared people. Today she had no choice. She had to come here. She couldn't stand by and let this guy kill again. Still, it was a long shot to ask the police to believe her, when she couldn't supply a time frame, a name, or even the location of victim or killer. She just didn't know. She squared her shoulders, hitched up her faded jeans. No more. Disbelief or not, she had to do this. She ran up the last few steps. The interior of the station felt no less imposing. 20-foot-tall ceilings lined with dark wood created a doomsday atmosphere. Great. She lined up and waited. When her turn arrived, she stepped to the counter. The officer glanced at her. "Can I help you, miss?" Wiping her damp palms on the front of her jeans, she took a deep breath and muttered, "Yes?" She paused, eyeing him carefully. How could she tell the good cops from the bad ones? The older-looking officer, his expression encouraging and steadfast, helped calm her nerves. Except her ability to judge people had never been good. Sam hesitated a moment longer, before the words blurted out on their own accord. "I need to talk to someone about a murder." He raised his eyebrows. 2 murders. Even she recognized the apology in her voice. His eyes widened. Okay, she sounded like she had one screw loose. Still, there wasn't any delicate way to approach this. She dropped her gaze to her tattered sneakers, almost hidden beneath her overly long pants. "What murders, miss?" His voice, so kind and gentle, contrasted with the sharpness of his gaze. Shifting, she glanced around. She didn't want to talk about this out in the open. The line of people started several feet behind her. Still, she leaned closer. "Please, I need to speak with someone in private." She twisted the ribbing of her forest green sweater around her fingers, a response to the intensity of his gaze. Catching herself, she stilled, as if locked in space and time. Not so her stomach, which roiled in defiance. This had to happen now, or she'd never force herself back again. When he nodded, she breathed a deep sigh of relief. "Thank you," she whispered. "Go take a seat. I'll contact someone." Sam spun away and stumbled into the next person in the line behind her. Flushing with embarrassment, she apologized and retreated to a chair against the far wall. She closed her eyes and rubbed her face as she calmed her breathing. She'd made it this far. The rest, well, she could only hope it would be just as easy. It wasn't. "Okay. Let's go over this one more time." The no-nonsense officer sat across from her in the small office. His crew cut had just enough silver at the tips to make him distinguished-looking, accenting what she suspected would be a black-and-white attitude. He scratched on the notepad for a moment and frowned. He tossed his pen and opened a drawer to search for another one. "2 women have been murdered? You just don't know who." He glanced from his notes to her in inquiry. She shook her head. "No, I don't." "Right," he continued, staring at her. "You don't know by whom. You say one man killed both women, but you don't know that for sure. And you don't know where these women could be. Is that correct?" Sam nodded again. Her fingers clenched together on her lap. "Therefore these women, if they existed and if they were murdered, could have lived anywhere in the world, right?" He quirked an eyebrow at her. "Right, but just answer the question. Could these women and their supposed killer be, for example, in England?" Her shoulders sagged. Why couldn't anything be easy? Theoretically, yes. But I'm not. I have enough dead women right here in Portland to go after. Why would I waste time working on a possible 2 more, who could have happened anywhere? Not only that, but you're saying that one woman was strangled and then stabbed, and the other one was just stabbed. That's not normal. Killers tend to stick to the same method for all their kills. His annoyance pinned her in place. Prove that a crime has happened. The detective tilted his head back, his arms gestured widely. "Show me a body, either here or somewhere else, and I'll be happy to contact law enforcement for that area. Until then, if you don't have anything else, why don't we call it a day?" He waved in the direction of the door. Sam stared at the irate officer, her initial optimism long gone. The problem was, everything he'd said was true. She didn't have anything concrete to tell him. She'd hoped the description of the ring would help validate her story. Frustration fueled her irritation. Both boiled over. "It's because of my abilities that I know these murders occurred close by." Sam poked her finger toward the floor. "I'm not strong enough to pick up images from so far away. These are your cases, you just need to identify them." "How?" he snarled. "You've given me no physical descriptions, no names, and no location markers. How can I identify them?" All the fight slipped down her back and drained out her toes. She studied him for a long moment. How could she get through to him? "The first woman will be in your case files, and, for this morning's victim, chances are the murder hasn't been called in yet. I'd hoped that knowing there was more than one victim would make you take notice." She paused. "Can't you use the ring to track down the killer?" She leaned closer. "He will kill again, you know. You will remember this conversation later." He shrugged, his eyes darting to the open doorway. He obviously wished she'd disappear, preferably forever. Sam assessed his face and found only disbelief. Her shoulders sagged. It wasn't his fault. He'd reacted as she'd expected. Skeptical and derisive. Sam flipped her braid over her back and rose. She tried. "There'd be no help here." "Fine. I don't have any proof and I didn't think you'd believe me, but Well, I had to try. She straightened her back, thanked the glowering officer, and escaped into the hallway. Ahead, the front window glinted with bouncing sunlight. Freedom beckoned. Her pace quickened. By the time she'd rounded the corner and caught sight of the front entrance, she'd broken into a half-run. 11:10 a.m. Detective Brant Sutherland smiled at the young rookie. "Thanks, Jenny. I appreciate this." Pink bloomed across her features, accenting her age, as did the ponytail high on the back of her head. Did they still wear those in school? As a new recruit, her arrival last week had caused quite a stir, her fresh innocence a joy to the department full of jaded detectives. "Sure, any time." She gave him a shy tilt of her lips at first, which then turned into a real grin, before she hurried back to her desk. Still in the hallway, Brant opened the file and glanced at the photos. His stomach dropped. His mood plummeted further, as he checked out the other pictures in the stack. Another one. Damn it. A commotion down the hall caught his attention. Glancing up, he frowned. What was that? A small bundle of moving clothing and flying hair bolted toward him. Brant jumped out of the way. His open file smashed against his chest, only to end up in her path anyway, as the tiny woman dodged sideways in a last-ditch attempt to miss him. As she stumbled, he reached out to steady her. "Easy does it. Watch where you're going." His hand never quite connected, as she slipped away like thin air. Huge chocolate-colored eyes framed by long velvet lashes flashed. "Excuse me," muttered the waif, before she continued her sprint to the front door, her long braids streaming behind her. "Wait," he shouted, but she'd gone, leaving Brant with an impression of soft doe eyes, evocatively large yet filled with unfathomable pain. Brant felt like he'd just been kicked in the stomach, or lower. Mixed impressions from those eyes flooded his mind. Frustration. Defeat. Pleading for help, but no longer expecting to receive any. Yet he could have sworn he sensed steel running through her spine. Somewhere along the line, life had knocked her down but not out. Never out. He took several steps after her, only to watch her bolt out the front door. Who the hell was she? He shook his head in bemusement. 2 seconds, and he'd felt enough for a psychological profile. Yeah, right. Still, how could anyone have that much torment going on and still function? Staring after her, he wished she hadn't escaped quite so fast. He didn't know what she needed or why, but surely he could have helped somehow. His curiosity aroused, he walked into the office at the end of the hall and studied the lone occupant. "Kevin, were you just talking to that young lady?" "What young lady?" Detective Kevin Bresson looked up from his keyboard, his gray eyes confused and disoriented. Reaching up, he jerked on the knot of his tie. "The tiny one who's all eyes." Kevin's brows beetled together, and then comprehension hit. "Oh, the skinny one." He shook his head and grimaced. "Jesus, I'd stay away from her if I were you." Brant stared toward the front entrance, unable to forget her haunting image. Or his inclination to follow her. A compulsion he had trouble explaining even to himself. Why? The moon must be full or close to it. The wackos are coming out of the woodwork. She's nuts? Brant pulled back slightly, jarred by Kevin's comment. No way. Yep, crazy as a bedbug. Kevin checked his desk calendar, pointed at today's date. Look at that. I'm right. It is a full moon tonight. Brant readily admitted that he didn't know much about the cosmos. Still, he'd have bet his last dollar that sanity lived in those eyes. Also a hint of desperation too, as if she'd hit the end of her rope maybe, but at least she'd known it. So what did she want? Brant worked to keep the interest out of his voice. Kevin tossed down his pen on his desk and leaned back. She tried to tell me this crazy-ass story about waking up inside another woman while she was being murdered. Kevin snorted. I've heard a lot of stories over the years, but that one topped my list. Brant straightened, stepped closer. She's a psychic? He didn't quite know how he felt about that. Kevin shot him a disgusted frown. If she is, she's not a very good one. Brant frowned. Why? What did she have to say? Something about a killer murdering 2 women. Both times, she says, she witnessed the murders as they happened, from inside the dead women's bodies. Kevin shrugged as if to say, people, what can you do? Even odder, she says this killer used a different mo each time. That was unusual, yet not unheard of. Brant only had to think of the current animal he was hunting. If Brant was right about him, this guy constantly changed his methods. Did she offer any proof? Some way to identify the killer? Did she know who the women were? At Kevin's shaking head, Brant felt pity for the woman. He hadn't been here at this station for long, and he didn't hold a position that invited confidences. Detectives were the same across the country. Some were good cops with limited imagination. Some had too much imagination and had a hard time playing by the rules. Kevin appeared to be squarely on the side of the disbelievers and rule-makers. Brant, well, he'd admittedly done more rule-breaking than was probably good for him. Old-fashioned detective work did the job most times, but not always. And he didn't give a damn where the help came from, as long as it came. He couldn't resist asking, anything concrete? Nope, Kevin answered with a superior half-smile. I told you, lots of nothing. Brant stared out the hallway, teeming with people. It had to be lunchtime. Damn. Just before walking through the doorway, he turned back one last time. Nothing useful. Nope, nada. Disgusted, Brant walked away. At least that partly explained the panic in her eyes. Except the ring, Kevin called out, snickering. Brant spun around. Ring? What ring? He walked over and put his palms on the desk. You didn't mention a ring. Kevin leaned back in surprise, his hand stalled midair. Hey, easy. I didn't think anything she said mattered. Fair enough. Grappling for patience, Brant threw himself down in the chair. What did she say? Fine. Kevin shifted to the side and reached for his notepad. He flipped through the pages until he found what he wanted. She didn't say much, he said, frowning at his notes. She woke up twice, inside different women while they were being murdered. She sees what the women see, and when they die, she snaps back into her own body. Brant frowned, puzzled. Odd ability to have. Where does the ring fit in? She said that when staring out of the women's eyes, Kevin rolled his eyes at that, she couldn't see much of the attacker because he wore a full ski mask like a balaclava. You know, the ones with only holes for the eyes and mouth. She remembers his eyes being black and dead-looking. And he paused for effect. Brant glared at him in annoyance. Come on. Come on. Stop the melodrama. Geez, you're a pain in the ass today. What gives? Brant rolled his eyes. Camaraderie was slowly developing with Kevin. Brant had joined the East Precinct 4 weeks ago, but on a temporary basis. His boss had arranged for Brant to have an office and to have access to all files, current and cold, as he searched for information on a potential serial killer before heading up a task force if his findings warranted one. He'd come into contact with this killer years ago and had run him to ground in Portland a year ago. Then nothing. A year. He couldn't believe they still didn't have a lead. This killer had become his nemesis. His Waterloo. Most of the guys here had accepted Brant. It would take time to develop more than that. Time he didn't have. Fine then. Quirking one eyebrow, Kevin continued to read. She mentioned seeing a ring during the one murder, and then she thought she recognized it again during the second one, he said in an exaggerated voice. Did she describe it? Kevin nodded and glanced down at his notes. Some sort of four-leaf clover pattern with a diamond in each of the leaves. A snake, or something similar, coils between them. According to her, one of the stones was missing. Brant sharpened his gaze. Color? Size? Gold? Silver? Kevin searched again through his notes and shook his head. Casting an eye at Brant, he said, "She didn't say, and, honestly, I didn't ask. I thought she was off her rocker." He scrunched his shoulders. Jesus, her cases aren't even related, yet she says it feels like the same killer. Something about having the same energy signature. Whatever the hell that means. He dropped his gaze, a frown furrowing his brows as he doodled on the corner of his notepad. "I gather you're not dismissing her story?" Brant considered that. He'd used psychics before. In fact, he'd been friends with Stefan Kronos for a long time. The reclusive psychic was a difficult person to get close to. And even more difficult to be close with. The man was painfully honest. Brant knew what valuable information they could give, but also knew using them could be a crapshoot. "I don't know what to think. The changing Mo thing is unusual, but it happens. That's why I'm here after all. If she had concrete information, it would have been easy enough to check out against our cases. But she didn't though, did she?" Kevin shook his head. "Not really. The last murder happened this morning, which could mean that we haven't found the victim yet, or it happened in a different country and we'll never hear anything about her. Oh yeah, this morning's victim had a tiled ceiling with deep crown moldings and frilly pink bedding. That is, if any of this can be counted on." He waited a heartbeat. "Here. Go for it. I'll log it in, but you can have this." He ripped off several pages from his notepad. "Personally, I think it's all bullshit." Brant half nodded and returned to his office. Bullshit or not, he'd still check it out. An hour later, Brant slumped back in his computer chair, stumped. Killers were normally predictable in their methods. They stayed with what worked, and few killers changed that. Those who did had been in business for a long time. They'd evolve. This made them incredibly difficult to hunt, as Brant well knew. He checked Kevin's notes again. With only a comment or two on the women's hair and the way they'd died, it would be hard to identify the victims. He had too many possibles to sort through. In a busy metropolis like Portland, murder was an everyday affair. Speaking into empty air, he said, "This is ridiculous. I need details, damn it." He needed a time frame or details of the victims themselves. How could Kevin not have asked for more? Not that he could blame Kevin. The city was overrun with nutcases. Who could tell them from the normal people these days? He scratched down a couple more questions before returning to his screen. This particular nut had a name, Samantha Blair. He tried to fit the name to the image of the skinny, panicked woman from the hallway. Back at his screen, he brought up all the information the database had to offer, which was scant at best. She was 28 years old with no priors, no outstanding warrants, and no tickets or parking violations. The phone rang, interrupting his search. "Hello." "Hi, sweetie. How are you today?" Brant leaned back with a grimace. "Mom, I'm fine. I told you yesterday. The headache was gone when I got home. Nothing to worry about." "Yes, dear. I just wanted to call and make sure you're feeling better." "I am. How are you? Are you ready to leave that place yet?" Brant pivoted in his chair to stare out the window. The sun had streaked through a few of the gray rain clouds, lighting the sky with colored swaths. "I'm not that good. My hip has mostly healed, but it still feels weak." She sniffled slightly. Brant grinned. What her hip had to do with a fake cold was anyone's guess. Still, she pulled out a sniffle every time. His mom should be sitting out on her little deck to her own apartment, not in the assisted living center a few miles out of town. She'd been happy there, very happy. She still had her apartment. This center was supposed to be a temporary situation. Somehow, every time Brant mentioned her leaving, her lung condition or diabetes acted up, or she came up with some other excuse to stay a little longer. The center didn't mind. They were in the process of adding a new wing to accommodate more seniors. His mom had money and paid her way. To be closer to her, Brant had requested the switch in precincts to this particular location. Her voice almost back to normal, she asked, "Do you have time for lunch today?" "No. Today's not good." "Oh dear. Well, how about tomorrow then?" "Mom, I'd love to if it's just the two of us. No more prospective girlfriends, okay?" "Now honey, I wouldn't do that. You explained how you felt about my interfering, as you called it." "But still," his mom said, her raspy voice dropping to a sad whisper, "I do want to see you settled before I die." "Oh hell," Brant muttered. The sweet long-suffering tone somehow conveyed lost hopes and dire endings soon to come. "Mom, you aren't dying. And I am in the hands of a good woman. Many good women, in fact." Her shocked gasp made him grin. "Don't say that. You need a wife, not those, she spluttered. He couldn't help but chuckle at her outrage. She deserved it for her constant interfering in his private life. Her persistence came closer to smothering than loving. Brant groaned under his breath. He straightened, stretching his back. "Enough about my girlfriends. Mom, is there anything else you need? Because I've got work to do." "No, I'll save it for lunch tomorrow at the Rock Cafe. Be there at 1 o'clock like you promised." Brant's chair snapped forward, his feet hitting the floor hard. "What? What's this?" She'd hung up on him. Damn it. Irritated, he stared at the phone in his hand. His mother's machinations were legendary, and though he hated being outmaneuvered, it was his fault. He'd been letting her get away with this for years, so no changing the status quo now. Good humor restored, he returned to his computer screen. According to Kevin, Samantha lived in the nearby community of Parksville, where she worked at a local vet's office part-time. The sparse facts didn't begin to explain the haunted weariness that had so touched him. He'd seen a similar look in the families of victims and those at the bottom of their world. He forced his attention back to Kevin's notes. It appeared Samantha had said something about both women having long hair. The one from several months ago had been a blonde, who'd been strangled. So how many unsolved cases could he find with long-haired murdered victims? His fingers flew across the keyboard. 3 cases listed for the last year. One of them flagged as possible prey of the bastard, the serial killer he'd followed to Portland. A killer who had been active for decades, possibly all over the states, with no one connecting the dots, until Brant. This killer's victims were always young, beautiful women, either happily married or in strong, committed relationships. All had been raped. And that's where the similarities ended. Some women were strangled in their beds, some stabbed in their living rooms, while others tortured for hours. Portland was the geographical center of the most recent attacks. The police had an old DNA sample that had degraded over the years, and a couple hairs from very early cases, and no one to check them against. This asshole had started his career before the labs became so sophisticated. He'd adapted and learned well. To date, they had no fingerprints and no hits on any databases. That's why Brant had trouble convincing his boss that they had a serial killer. Hence his job, pulling together everything he could find to get the backing for the task force to hunt down this asshole. A knock sounded on his door. "Move it, Brant. We've got another one."